With new Subaru vehicles being extremely scarce these days, it's prime time to look at buying a used Subaru. Buying a used car can be a scary and stressful situation, but hopefully this video helps put your mind at ease. In today's video, we're going to be talking about two of Subaru's most popular models, that being the Legacy and the Outback. There are so many years, trims, and options to choose from. Today we'll talk about what years and models to buy and which ones you may want to avoid. So, being that there are so many years and models that could potentially be on your list of cars to consider, we're going to try to keep this range to the last 20 years or so, to about year 2000. Now, I'm sure there are some of you that are looking at cars much older than this, but we're not going to be including those in this video. Primarily, we're going to focus on model year 2000 to 2019. We'll start off by talking about my absolute favorite Subaru of the last 20 years, that being the BH, BE, and BT chassis of Outback, Legacy, and Baja. They covered model years 2000 to 2004 in the Legacy and Outback. The Baja ran for a few years after. These cars are, in my opinion, some of the best Subarus that Subaru ever produced. This being the convergence point where Japanese quality and efficiency peaked in vehicle production. Now, I can argue that this was the time that most Japanese vehicles peaked, not just Subaru. Others like Honda and Toyota as well. Back to these Outbacks. These Outbacks were still a station wagon before it became the oversized, bloated crossover SUV that it is today. These Outbacks offered several trim levels. They had the Outback model, the Limited, and they had the top tier LL Bean and VDC models. Legacy saw the Brighton, the L, and GT trims. You had two engine options. The EJ251, a 2.5-liter 4-cylinder Boxer 4, and the EZ30D, a 3-liter H6 Boxer 6-cylinder engine. You had two options for transmission. You had the 4EAT conventional automatic, and you had a 5-speed manual, which means you could have an absolute stripped-down base model, or you could have the top-tier limited trim with all the bells and whistles with the 2.5-liter engine. On the other hand, the 3-liter engine was in the top tier trims, the LL Bean and the VDC. But that said, you could get a VDC with cloth interior and fewer options, although rare to be ordered in such a configuration. You could also get a sunroof option, which with this chassis meant you had a dual sunroof. You had one sunroof for the front occupants and one for the rear occupants. These are some of the most well-built Outbacks that can be found, finding them with several 100,000 miles very regularly. There are still a lot of these on the road. So what are some of the problems with this model of Outback? Well, the big elephant in the room is the EJ251 engine and the oh-so-well-known head gasket failures. These engines had the notoriously bad single-layer graphite-coated gasket that was prone to failure between about 120 and 150,000 miles. Now, seeing as how most of these vehicles are 20 years old or older, you're not really going to find these head gasket issues much in the used market. Most of them have already been replaced or repaired properly. Not all of them, but most of them. So you still need to be wary of it and get a pre-purchase car inspection done or know how to check it out yourself. Now, the 6-cylinder engine, the EZ30D, was not known for having this failure of the head gaskets, but with age and mileage, some of them are failing their head gaskets now. But it wasn't due to the same reason as the 4-cylinder engine. It's important to keep in mind that the failure of the head gaskets on the 6-cylinder is a much bigger issue than those on the 4-cylinder due to the increased cost of the repair. As far as transmissions go, the 4EAT is probably one of the best automatic transmissions Subaru has offered in the last 20 years, meaning by way of reliability, not so much by way of performance or fuel economy, because it was a 4-speed automatic. The 4EAT is your only option if you got the H6 engine, but if you got a 4-cylinder engine, you got to pick between the 4EAT automatic and a 5-speed manual. These cars really didn't have a lot of major issues that were seen across the board. There were quite a few smaller things, mostly cosmetic, like the passenger dashboard. There was a pad between the airbag and the glove box door that was notorious for cracking and tearing up due to UV sunlight damage. If you're looking at one of the dual sunroof models, you have to be wary of leaks. These models were known for leaking with age at the rear sunroof drains and leaking into the back of the car. Another big concern for these vehicles is rust. So many have rust issues in the Northeast, Midwest, and Northwestern regions. They're notorious for rotting out around the rear wheel wells. With time, this rust can get into the rear strut mounts and rear subframe and cause total failure of the rear suspension. Another issue was wind noise, and that wasn't just found on these 2000 to 2004 models. It was found on models prior and the models that followed in 2005 to 2009. These vehicles have frameless windows, and people are bad about closing the doors by pushing on the window glass rather than the door handle. This stretches and strains the window gussets, causing air noise while driving on the highway. And that's pretty much the highlights for these 2000 to 2004 Outback Legacy models. All around great vehicles with proper care, maintenance, and if you can find them rust-free. Moving on, we'll look at the BLBP chassis of Outback Legacy, model year 2005 to 2009. Now these are some of my personal least favorite Outback and Legacy models. There seemed to just be a big dip in the build quality compared to the previous 2000 to 2004 models. Again, you had several trims with these vehicles. You had the 2.5i base, Premium, and Limited. You had the new 2.5 XT and GT, and then you had the 3.0R Premium, Limited, and LL Bean Edition. There was a new engine option with the XT and GT models, and that was the EJ255 turbocharged engine. This being the same engine that was offered at the time in the WRX. The previously mentioned head gasket issues were still a problem during these years on the 2.5-liter naturally aspirated engines, now known as the EJ253. On the later models of these EJ253 engines, you saw the addition of Subaru's AVLS system, or Active Valve Lift System. This added complexity to these engines and added cost in repairs and replacement of these engines. Aside from the head gasket issues, valve guides became an issue as well. The higher mileage engines were known for frequently dropping valve guides due to carbon buildup on the valves, wedging between the valve and the guide and causing friction, forcing the guide down with the valve over time as it opened and closed. The AVLS system also presented some issues in the form of check engine lights and rough engine running, but this was primarily due to neglect from owners' lack of periodic oil changes. The new option, the XT and GT with the EJ255 turbocharged engine, wasn't free from issues either. Now, the head gaskets weren't a known failure point on these engines, but with age, neglect, and stress, mostly from aggressive driving, some of them have failed. The larger issue here was mechanical issues, mainly in the form of spun rod bearings and turbocharger failures. With the rod bearings, these failures were normally attributed to poor maintenance and abusive driving. There were some issues where the brazing on the oil pickup tube would crack, sucking air rather than oil and starving the engine of oil. There were also some instances of oil pump housing screws backing out, causing drops in oil pressure. The turbocharger also saw an early demise at the hands of poor oiling. The oil feed line for the turbo and the AVCS system had banjo bolts with mesh filters in them. These fine filters would clog from age and lack of periodic oil changes, and once these filters clogged, they'd starve the turbocharger of oil, causing premature failures. If not caught early enough, the failed turbo could dump debris into the engine oil and wipe out the engine as well. Lastly, the H6 engine, the newly updated EZ30D Phase 2. These engines got a slight revision from their earlier iteration and got added to them the AVCS system and AVLS system. They moved from a cast aluminum intake manifold to a polycarbonate one. The cylinder heads were also reworked, moving from a single-port exhaust head to a multi-port exhaust head. There were some issues with the VVT systems on these engines and timing chains, mainly in the form of noise with the timing chains, but both issues again were attributed to poor maintenance and lack of regular oil changes. Two more transmissions were added to the mix for this model range. We carried over the old 4EAT conventional auto and the 5-speed manual from the previous 2000 to 2004 models, but we added the, at the time, new 5EAT 5-speed automatic transmission on certain engines, and the 6-speed manual option that was mainly found on the Legacy GT Spec B. The manual transmission and 4EAT stayed rock steady reliable, but there were some valve body torque converter issues with the 5EAT. The 2005 to 2009 chassis suffered from the same wind noise as the previous models with the frameless windows. There was a big issue with a condition known as sticky dash. This was a phrase coined for the phenomena that happened on these models. The dashboard pad would become extremely sticky with age and UV light exposure. Subaru did issue a recall and replaced a lot of these dashes free of charge, but the recall was a very short run, only lasting about a year, and many people didn't get to go in for their free dashboard, so there's plenty running around with this condition still today. And it's not a very cheap condition to fix yourself, as a dashboard assembly cost upwards of $650 from Subaru. Now, the center console lid, they were also known to blister and shrivel up like cooked bacon, again from UV light damage and just general aging. Aside from that, other things to note were issues of failing HVAC blend mode door actuators. These caused noise in the dashboard and prevented the correct temperature of air and the correct output of airflow from the dash. Now, these are relatively easy and cheap to repair, but something nonetheless to keep in mind. There were some airbag issues as well, in the form of airbag lights. Some were from the passenger airbag indicator light, which was a quick fix with reflowing a cracked solder joint, and there was also issues from the passenger seat occupant detection sensor / module that was located under the passenger seat. Another cheap and easy repair, as you can find them pretty regularly on eBay, and they just bolt in and plug up under the seat with no programming required. These models suffer from what some claim to be an erratic handling on wet and icy roads, coined ghost walking. Now, personally, I've never experienced this issue on these chassis. I'm not sure if it's due to suspension wear, bad rear shock absorbers, or what, but it's nothing that I've experienced, so I've only read about it on Subaru forums from people that claim to have experienced this. Another complaint is the rear wheel bearings and the amount of failures that they have. It seems that the wagon is more susceptible than the sedan to rear wheel bearing failures. Other than that, they're pretty solid vehicles. Most issues with them are not huge to deal with and fairly easy and cheap to repair. Now to the 2010 to 2014 models. This is where the Legacy Outback grew outwards in size and inwards in their interior room. The days of the station wagon are behind the Outback. The Legacy wagon is now no more. The only way to have the wagon in the US is with the Outback now. Outback models are now the 2.5i Premium, the 2.5i Limited, the 3.6R Premium, and 3.6R Limited. They had a special appearance package offered that later was coined the Touring Package. The EJ253 is dumped mid-year cycle, leaving the Outback and Legacy in model year 2012. Model year 2013 and 2014, we see the new, at the time, FB25B engine go in its place. Gone now are the head gasket failures of the 2.5-liter four-cylinder engines. The 3-liter engine is replaced in the 2010 model with a new 3.6-liter Boxer 6, the EZ36D. Larger displacement, more power, and now running on 87-octane fuel rather than the 93-octane required for the outgoing 3-liter. The EJ255 Turbo is around, but for a small amount of time in the very last handfuls of 2.5 GT legacies. On the transmission side, we see the loss of the old and reliable 4EAT transmission. It is now replaced by the TR580 and TR690 CVT. The 5-speed manual is gone as well, leaving us only the 6-speed manual option. The 5EAT remains as the only transmission for the new 3.6-liter H6 engine. I really have grown to like these models of Legacy and Outback. They had to grow on me though. I really missed my station wagon sized Outback for the longest time, but when I bought my 2014 3.6R Limited with the special appearance package, it didn't take long for me to enjoy the larger size and more comfortable interior. We got an increase in ground clearance, cargo room, and interior space with this chassis. We also saw the introduction of Subaru's EyeSight system, the first release of the system in the US market. Now normally it was only found on the higher end and fully equipped models during this time period. Nicer materials were used and better build quality was found than the previous 2005 and 2009 models, in my opinion. Very solid and reliable vehicles at the end of the day. As far as issues go, mechanically we still had a few head gasket issues on the last 2010 to 2012 EJ253s. They were now nowhere near as prevalent due to the design change of the gasket that was sorely needed. Many of these engines have made it over 200,000 miles with the factory gasket now. We lose the head gasket issues with the then new FB25B engine, but we see a new problem with this engine, and that comes in the form of oil consumption. Some of the FB engines were consuming oil, not all of them, but some of them. Some consumed a moderate amount and some were consuming massive amounts. Subaru extended the warranty to cover and replace the problems with these engines. Most you'll find now in the used market are free of the oil consumption issues. Most of them, not all of them. There's still some that are going to consume some oil, some that didn't get replaced under the extended warranty. Another new issue with this engine series is oil leaks, and that mainly comes from the new timing chain covers as we switch from a timing belt to a timing chain, and the cam carriers. These engines have a lot of RTV silicone sealing them up, way more areas for oil leaks than the outgoing EJ series engine. Now, there's greater expense when it comes to fixing the oil leaks on these F-Series engines compared to the outgoing EJs, as the engine has to be removed from the car on the FB to do the oil gasket reseal, whereas the EJ could be done in-car. The new at the time EZ36D saw the dropping of the AVLS system in favor of dual AVCS. The EZ36D remained mostly issue-free, but there were some rare instances of external head gasket oil leaks. Most of these were fixed by Subaru under warranty, and you likely won't see them in the used market, but something to be wary of and have checked out. The new issues were the CVT. The CVT got a bad rap early on, much like the 2.5-liter head gasket issues did. Now, that's not to say that the 2.5-liter head gaskets didn't happen. They absolutely did, but they were so blown out of proportion that most people that think about Subarus now completely associate them with engines that have failed head gaskets when it was just that one series of engine and not the entire product line. So now a lot of people associate CVTs and Subarus to failure when it's not that cut and dry. Yes, there were some failures of the CVT because it was an all-new transmission and driveline for Subaru. There were issues that had to be worked out, as with anything new. Most of the preliminary issues were worked out under the Subaru extended CVT warranty. Now that said, there were still some CVT issues. The early 2010 to 2012 TR690s suffered from torque converter issues. The torque converter clutch wouldn't disengage when coming to a stop, causing the engine to stall. Another issue was with the valve body. There were issues with solenoids failing, normally at higher mileages, and the main issue here being that individual solenoids were not offered for sale from Subaru, but instead sold as an assembly with the entire valve body, which meant that the entire valve body at the tune of $800+ had to be replaced rather than $30 to $40 solenoids alone. Other than this, there weren't a lot of common failures. Rear wheel bearing failures were still on the list, and rust was still an issue, as with basically all Subarus. Some of these models are now having the same issues with the HVAC blend mode door actuators as the earlier 05 to 09s. There were issues with headlight bulbs burning out early and the infamous Takata airbag recalls. There was a reduction in overall handling and responsiveness of these cars compared to the previous models just due to the increase in weight and size. Overall, it's still a great choice in an Outback or Legacy. On to the final model range, and this is 2015 to 2019 models. Here we have the 2.5i Premium, 2.5i Limited, the 2.5i Touring, the 3.6R Premium, 3.6R Limited, and the 3.6R Touring. At the tail end of this chassis, we see the introduction of the EyeSight system as standard across all models and trims. We also see the death of the H6 engine, the EZ36D. As far as transmissions are concerned, we lose the manual and the conventional transmissions. All we have now are the TR580 and TR690 CVT. We see much of the same engine and driveline issues on the 15 to 19 models as we saw on the 10 to 14 models. Oil leaks from the cam carriers and timing chain noises, oil consumption, and slight amounts of external head gasket oil leaks from the H6 engines. We do see a nice upswing in quality and materials used, and the cars are much more refined than the Subarus before them. We see quite a few issues in these cars though, and they are as listed. The radios. There was a huge issue with the Harman Kardon sound system in the upscale models. The radio screens would go black. They were recalled and they were replaced by Subaru, but there are still issues with some of the recalled replaced units. The windshields. There were lots of issues of unexplained cracking of the windshields in these vehicles, so much so that it resulted in a class action lawsuit against Subaru. The batteries. Batteries failed. Batteries died on these vehicles quite regularly due to parasitic draw from the CAN system. Many allege that the batteries are also undersized for the vehicle and its electrical loads. Rodent damage. Subaru switched to an eco-friendly soy-based wiring harness covering that happened to attract rodents. Rodents have chewed through and damaged a lot of the wiring in these vehicles over the last few years. Most of these wiring harnesses have been replaced under warranty by Subaru, but it's still something to be aware of. The Denso fuel pump failures, another round of recalls and replacements on these cars. Then there was another round to recall some of the recalled pumps. Again though, a warranty issue, a recall issue that's been handled by Subaru. Lastly, there were EyeSight issues. Many customers were complaining with the system and how it reacted. Subaru came in with reprogramming of the system and updates to help alleviate customer concerns. Still, these newest batch of used Subarus seem to be the most problem-ridden, mainly due to the inclusion of so much technology in modern vehicles. So guys, there you have it, a rundown of Subaru Legacy Outbacks over the last 20 years. I hope this information is helpful to those of you looking to buy a used Subaru. Don't let the issues turn you away from buying one of these Subaru vehicles. No vehicle is without its issues. I've merely just compiled the list of the most common failures for each model range. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.